Hello, this is Michael O'Donnell. I'm the program chair of the Art and Science of Health Motion Conference, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation with Dr. Richard Citrin on the resilience advantage, stronger, tougher, smarter. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. He is an organizational and counseling psychologist. He's a consultant, an entrepreneur, an author, and an actor, although he might use a slightly different term. He's president of Citrin Consulting. He's co-author of The Resilience Advantage, which was just published in 2016. Also a contributor to the Health Promotion in the Workplace text, which I was actually the lead editor for. He has built and sold a behavioral health company, which was eventually sold to Humana. He also led the health and wellness efforts at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center Insurance Services Division during its startup decade. He established the health promotion program at the state of Arkansas. He's a former psychology professor at Texas Christian University, received his PhD from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and his MBA from the University of Dallas. And he's an improv performer who has performed all around the world. So that's something that when I first met him, I was just very impressed by that. I'd also like you to know that he is speaking at the Art and Science of Health Motion Conference. That'll be the last week of March. And with that, I'd like to jump right into it. I'll start by asking Richard several questions. So Richard, you've been advocating for shifting our conversation away from stress management to building personal and organizational resilience. So what's your reasoning behind this, both from a scientific perspective and a receptivity perspective?
Well, Michael, first of all, thank you for having me on and for the opportunity to present at the conference later in the month. I'm looking forward to sharing these ideas and meeting all the amazing people who will be at the conference. I'll try not to improv this session, though. I've made some notes, so I'm well planned out for this. And I think the answer to your question is that there's both an art and science to my thinking around moving away from stress management. And I think the major reason for me is that I just don't think that stress management programs are as effective as we want them to be, particularly in the workplace. From the research point of view, Towers Watson and the National Business Group on Health have done a number of studies. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with it, the Staying at Work studies that have been going on for 7 or 8 years now. And several key elements of those studies talk about the fact that employers not only don't understand why their employees feel stressed. In other words, there's a mismatch between what employees say they're stressed about and what employers perceive that they're stressed about, but where employers have actually put efforts into stress management programs, they report very little significant benefit to them. They just don't see them as having made a difference in the workplace. I think the art side of it is that and I certainly have been complicit in this. We've been teaching stress management programs for the past 70 years, and I think everybody knows how to take deep breaths and relax and close their eyes in these programs. But I don't think that we've gone much beyond that in terms of particularly improving the workplace. I think we've made a difference for individuals, but not necessarily in the workplace. And that's my particular interest, and I think the interest of many of the listeners.
Okay. Well, you brought up the idea of the workplace. Can you give us some examples about how resilience and having a resilience mindset can make a practical and meaningful difference for people's lives at work?
Well, it's interesting. Although I have a background in health promotion and wellness, and I've really spent much of my career in healthcare, the past 8 years or so, I've been really focused in workplace issues and have been doing a lot of work in organizational consulting, strategy, team building, as well as looking at this issue of resilience and building resilience into programs. And I think one of the opportunities that we have is to be looking more at what the business challenges are that managers and leaders see in the workplace. In other words, I think what I've seen and I've done in terms of stress and productivity has been talking about things like improving presenteeism or improving workplace productivity. But when we drill down much more discretely to that, we see that there's opportunities around things like workload management, which is one of the major areas of concern for employers and employees. Another area is change management, and there's been work done in resilience around change management, but organizations are going through change all the time, and I think we miss an opportunity to build resilience into those models. And I think a third area is around what I call success and failure management. How do we post hoc and analyze and really pre-mortem what it is that we're going to do to build success, or how are we going to address failure that happens in the workplace, which happens all the time. Organizations tend not to do very well at this, and those represent opportunities around resilience to build those strategies in.
So that's some of the ways we approach this, but why should individuals care about this? And before you answer, I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question, type it in your question box, and I'll pose those questions to Richard. So Richard, why, if I'm working someplace, why do I care about taking resilience training? How is that going to benefit me personally at work?
Oh, are you talking about as an individual, or as a business leader?
As an individual, why do I care about it as an individual?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've learned in my work as a consultant is I try to avoid the word training, because trainings tend to be one-off experiences for people, and very little is taken away from that. In fact, most of the learning literature suggests that within the matter of 48 hours after those experiences, 50% of the learnings are taken out. And it increases as time goes out. So I'm much more interested in really the development of things like a resilient mindset. How do we build that in, particularly with managers, so that they understand what it is that they can do to support their employees on an ongoing basis, or what employees can do on a team basis to support one another in relationship to things like sharing workload with one another. So I'm really working on trying to create again, as you used it, and the term I use, Michael, is a mindset around these strategies. So it's not just doing a training. I tend to find those are exciting, but not necessarily very effective.
Well, I don't think you're answering my question. It sounds like you're talking about organizations doing this, but why do I care? What's it going to do for me? Why do I want to do it?
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. I think you care because most people are reporting that they're still working in high levels of stress in the workplace, and that they're not finding good strategies to address those particular issues. So, for example, one of the pieces that's very big is work overload. And when we think about that from a stress management approach, there may not necessarily be good strategies that people put into place. One of the keys that I talk about around the resilience work is that stressful times are unavoidable, and that's why I say you can't manage stress. You can't manage stress. Stress manages you, if anything. And so the issue about workload management is a constant in the workplace. Recognizing the ebb and flow of around how the stress operates in your workplace begins to give people a perspective that in most settings, it may not be constant at the 90th percent level. It may dip down to 50%. It may ebb up to 95%. There's an ebb and flow to how these things happen in the workplace for most employees that I work with. And so when you have that resilience understanding, you recognize that when the flow is a little lower, you do some things to take care of yourself. You back off from some of the work. You refocus and examine what the priorities are. And it's the same thing when it becomes more intense. How do you build a resilient strategy, and how do you change your thinking so that you recognize that now is going to be a period of heavy time? And maybe now's a time when I have to not answer the phone from 6 to 8, or not take a look at my emails because I've been in there since 6 o'clock. So the mindset around resilience gives you a perspective that the stress level ebbs and flows, for one example, and that you can address that a little bit more differently than trying to just manage it.
Okay. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to tell us some of the key strategies that individuals can deploy to build personal resilience. But first, I want to jump to a question from Bill McPeak. He says, aren't stress management and resilience different concepts? Stress management is coping. Resilience is a higher order concept.
You know, it's interesting, Bill. I listened to Raquel Garzon's presentation on resilience a few weeks ago that you did with her, Michael. And
Yes.
I'll be attending her session, by the way. I'm looking forward to it at the conference on that Monday. And Raquel commented that she thought resilience was a part of stress management. But I would say it's a little different. I actually think that stress management is a part of resilience. And that's because I define resilience a little bit differently. And Bill, your comment about it being the higher order, my definition of resilience is not just about bouncing back. My definition of resilience is our ability to effectively plan for, embrace, and gracefully recover from challenging and stressful events in such a way that we're strengthened by that experience. So for me, I think about the situation that we may know a stressor is coming up. How can we prepare for it? That's what in resilience is referred to as building hardiness and building preparation. Navigation is that middle phase, and that's when we're in the middle of it. Maybe you're in a meeting with your manager, or your child is having a temper tantrum. You're in the middle of that stress. That's when the body's reacting to it. How can we navigate through that period a little bit more easily? And some stress management strategies like breathing are good ones to use. The final piece is around the idea of, I like to think of as bouncing forward more than just bouncing back. We don't want to return to our normal state in most situations. We want to learn from them and grow from them and take something away. So I have a bit of an expanded definition of resilience. I'm not expecting Webster's to adopt it, but it's a good practical one for me to use. And I think for clients that I work with, they like having that larger perspective. So Bill, I appreciate your idea. I agree with it.
And Richard, I'd like to actually build on that with a question from Jim Purcell. He says, could you explain for us what a typical stress management program would entail so that we can better distinguish it from what you're proposing?
Yeah, so I think a typical stress management program, tends to focus on, first of all, they tend to focus on individual skill building. So they look at, they always look at things with ways to relax is always a key factor in a stress management program. They may talk about separate components of stress, of trying to manage your stress, such as things like managing your time better. Time management is another concept I don't agree with. I don't think we manage time. I think time manages us. So in resilience, I talk more around priority settings, determining how you could take more control of your life rather than doing a time management study is another area. We often talk about affirming values within a stress management program. And a lot of the programs within stress management are good. Affirmations, for example, is another area that's taught about in stress management programs. Learning to say no is another one that's talked about in stress management. Mindfulness today is a very current one that we talk about in relationship to building stress management programs. So those, I think everybody's program is a little different. I think the challenge that I see is that it's not really integrated into a model that people can use on an everyday basis. Few people really develop good skills in meditation or see the application of it for resilience or for dealing with their stress effectively. And many of the other tools are just not well integrated into addressing the workplace, particularly. Individually, they're very beneficial.
So Richard, I'm going to jump to the question I told you I was going to pose with a little bit of a twist. And the general question is, what are some key strategies that individuals can deploy to build personal resilience? And I'm going to also ask you to address a question by Taylor Cordova, who asks or says, I work with students in a residential treatment center who struggle heavily with resilience. Hearing some specific strategies on how to help others find resilient strategies for themselves would be great insight.
Good. Well, I'll try to build both of those in. I think there's a couple of suggestions I would make in terms of individual resilient strategies. I think one of the steps that I like to talk about in terms of resilience is that resilience is not something we develop. Resilience is something we have. It is hardwired into our system. It is our drive for survival at its simplest level. And when we think about tragic or horrific events, such as the Parkland shooting a few weeks ago, we can see how those kids have bounced forward from that experience. They're now advocating for legislation that they believe will be helpful in stopping school shootings. And so the first step is really around your own self-awareness, looking and evaluating how you've handled adversities and challenges before. What have been your successes? The negativity bias, one of our cognitive biases, tells us that we don't do very well or we're not successful in what we do. And everybody on this call and most of the people we deal with in our lives are highly successful and have achieved great things. So self-awareness is the first step, recognizing what it is that we do and do well. The second one is this idea of mindset, which is how do we get out of that victim shift that we get in our head and turn that around so we get more control for ourselves in our lives. I like to suggest the use of mantras for that. The 12-step people have the Serenity Prayer, which is essentially a prayerful mantra, and a prayer may be within your religious tradition. It's something that helps calm you down. For resilience, I like to use mantras like I've handled this before and I can do so again. Or I can see how I can change this situation from something that I have faced in the past. So I like to suggest the use of mantras or little phrases that we can use for mindsets, and that could work for some of Taylor's clients at the treatment center, is to put some expressions up on the wall that you want them to use as a way of reminding themselves. I like to remember in the movie Rudy, at the Notre Dame locker room, they have a sign as the players are going down the steps that says, "Play like a champion today." And they have that, all sports teams have that as reminders of how they want the team and players to play. I think the third piece of advice I would give, or recommendation that I talk about in the Resilience Advantage, is to look for the learning. So every experience has a learning advantage, a learning opportunity to it. And it builds on Carol Dweck's work around growth mindsets as well. It helps us see that every experience we have, we can learn something from that. And I always say, I'm amazed at how stupid I was 2 weeks ago, because I'm always on the learning lookout. And when I make those discoveries, I can see that I do things differently the next time. So I think those are three examples. And I think the idea of mantras or signage for you, Taylor, might be a way of helping some of your residents to think more around resilience and some of the behavior controls that you might want to get them to engage with.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to jump now from key strategies an individual can deploy and ask what are some key strategies that leaders can deploy, and also like to weave in a question from Sophia Asgar. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And she asks, can you speak about tactics and strategies for a culture or team versus the individual?
Sure. So I want to just give a little background here, if I may. I talked a little bit about organizations a few minutes ago, and I want to mention why I think the organization piece is becoming particularly exciting. A lot of my work, as I mentioned, is around leadership development, and what I'm beginning to see within organizations now is that they are addressing leadership development, or what's often referred to as leadership standards or leadership competencies, that specifically include resilience or some derivation of resilience. It may be responding to change or building agility. In fact, one of my clients, a big bank here in Pittsburgh, its PNC Bank has a competency called demonstrates resilience, that they expect their leaders to demonstrate resilience, which means that they create a work environment that anticipates changes, reacts quickly, and reduces unnecessary stress that impacts performance. So right there in the language is a request for help around stress, and their expectation is that their managers will be able to and are expected to be able to do that.
So this is an expectation of the individuals in leadership roles.
That is the expectation for individuals at each level of leadership. So that to me is pretty, that's pretty big.
Yeah.
And that's not the only company. I'll be talking about another company as well at the presentation and sharing some of what they are using in relationship to building that leadership standard into the development of their leaders. And that's not coming out of the health and wellness group.
So at the organizational level, one thing I'm hearing is that employers can state that their leaders need to have these skills, but are there things that leaders can do to build organization level resilience? And also, talk about the culture and the team importance there.
Right. And I think the critical aspect is, again, that self-awareness. If the organization is familiar with kind of stress levels that happen for employees and look to develop those strategies, they can do it. I'll share an example of that for you. When my business was acquired, I worked for a national healthcare company. And one day they announced that they were going to, it was a managed care company, and that they were going to pick up around 300,000 lives and essentially add about 25% of the business, grow the business by about 25%. And these kinds of additions usually take about 9 months to implement, but we were told we had 120 days, 4 months to do it.
Huh.
Well, it was quite a challenge, not just technically, but in hiring people and training them and getting them up to speed to do the work that was required. What the company recognized was there was only so much that we could do without stressing our team out, and we had been talking about resilience at that point as well. And so they made a lot of adaptations in this major change management issue. They moved to 3 shifts, or they had 3 shifts, but they expanded them and gave people more flexibility about that. They asked people to, consider working on weekends, and of course they'd have weekdays off. We provided people with gift cards and meal cards. We brought food in for people. We arranged for some gym memberships for people to use. But most importantly, we created a sense of teamwork and team commitment to the larger mission, this idea of superordinating a mission. So it's not simply your group or your team, but something larger. And that created a level of commitment to the challenge that we had. And that's another piece of research that was done by Salvador Matti that talked about the importance of challenge and commitment in the workplace. And if we can create that for employees, that builds their hardiness and creates a resilient workplace where they're more engaged with what they're trying to do.
Okay, interesting. So a little different direction, my next question. We think about technology actually increasing our stress levels a lot of times, but what are some of the ways that you see technology can actually help people develop resilient skills? And what are some sort of themes people can think about, keep in mind as they're using technology?
Yeah, so although the technology can cause us to increase our stress, technology is also a great time saver, and there's a lot of great tools that can be used to help us mitigate some of the stress and challenges. I particularly like a lot of the meditation and mindfulness apps. I think can be particularly helpful. These are Headspace, for example, or Omvana is another one that's used. And one of the areas that I'm working in is around the idea of drip learning. This is how can we help people to develop a habit or develop a mindset. And as I said earlier, we want to develop that and not train it so that people get messaging over a period of time. And there's a group here in Pittsburgh that has used some University of Pittsburgh neuroscientists to develop a micro-learning experience that comes up on people's cell phones as a text message and then alerts them to go to or gives them the opportunity to go to a website to just have a 60 or 90 second experience around resilience. It may be around breathing exercise. It may be around how to reframe a situation, maybe how to not try to be perfect. The program is called Thrive, and I think it represents an interesting opportunity for people to think about developing this ongoing mindset around building resilience, or really using it for any kind of learning. But that's really how we learn is over time, and not these one shot wonders. So I think technology has a great future in this, and I think we're seeing it in the whole adoption of applications and technology in healthcare.
That's interesting. And this is, I see a question from Devin Wayne, which I don't know how to sort of weave it into this conversation. And it may be, well, I'll just ask you and you can respond to it. He says, you mentioned gift cards. He said, what are your thoughts about using incentives in regard to resilience or creating positive behavior? So the positive behavior one is a little bit of an extension, but do incentives have a role in resilience skill development?
I have to be honest, Michael, I don't really know enough about the use of resilience. I know enough about the use of resilience. I don't know enough about the use of incentives in that regard. I think in the program we were doing at my former company is really more around rewards than incentives for people. But I know there's some good literature on the use of incentives in health promotion. And
the rewards are certainly closely tied to incentives.
Yes.
So it's a question it's something I hadn't thought of, and my guess is it's striking you the same way, but something worth thinking about.
Anything that helps, I guess I would answer, anything that helps people to focus on something is good. Whether or not ultimately resilience, understanding, as well as things like weight management and tobacco cessation, these have to be pieces of habit change that people ultimately take on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I'm still processing that question, so I'm not sure I agree or disagree with you on that. So Sophia asked another question. Basically, how do we measure personal and organization resilience?
Well, there are some instruments that we can use to measure personal resilience. I'm not sure there are too many out there that measure organizational resilience. However, I'll be honest with you, what I look for, and it's been interesting as I've gotten into my consulting work, people often refer to these kinds of things as soft skills. I tend to shy away from that term because I think it was intended to contrast with with hard skills like financials, and soft skills has been of a denigration of these important communication and personal management skills. I prefer to think of them as the essential skills. What I find when I talk to leaders, though, is that they're not hung up on hard measures to assess the improvement in people. What they're interested in is how it's going to impact workplace productivity, how it's going to demonstrate that my team is more focused, or they're getting things done on time more effectively, or that they have less turnover around these issues because they have higher engagement in the workplace. So I certainly can use engagement work, which most companies are using now, whether it's a Gallup score or a Net Promoter Score. But I find most of the consulting I do, people are not hung up on having hard data results for measuring resilience.
So I'm going to ask a big question. It's a short question, big answer, even though we have just about 90 seconds left. When we're doing programs in work settings, what type of evaluation measures are appropriate, either in measuring, you mentioned big ones like productivity. How do we measure this? Do we try to measure change at the individual level? Are there organization level changes we try to measure?
Once again, I'll just share what I said a moment ago, which is that the people I work with, and that's not coming out of a health promotion side, that's coming out of a leadership development side or a team effectiveness side, are interested in whether the team is working more effectively together as measured by decreased time on projects, or fewer complaints from customers, or decreased turnover. So I look at what are the business outcomes that the client is wanting to achieve through this program. And I think that's one of the important takeaways in health promotion. I think we tend to think about what we view as important in terms of an outcome. So it's how many pounds people lost in their weight loss program at the workplace. Well, that's interesting, but it doesn't impact bottom line. And I think that's what employers are interested in looking at, bottom line or employee retention, or some of the business outcomes that matter to them. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm very interested in getting feedback and hearing from others about how we can shift the conversation more to business outcomes that address the needs of our clients, and be less concerned about perhaps the scientific outcomes that we're looking for, that we've been looking for in health promotion over the years.
And also, part of what I heard you say there is we need to look at the outcomes that are important to our individual client organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. As well as what the individuals need. Believe me, I'm a psychologist, and when I talk to people about resilience, I've got 10 people coming up to me afterwards and say, "Can you talk to me for a little bit about my son or my daughter, or my husband lost his job, or my sister has developed breast cancer?" I hear that all the time, and certainly those are important things. And if that can create a little more happiness or content or ease for people, that's a worthwhile quality to be going for in these trainings and these development work as well.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Citrin, for meeting with us today, and thank you to everybody who's been on the call. I'd like to remind you that Dr. Citrin is speaking at our Art and Science of Health Motion Conference, which will be in San Diego the last week of this month, and I hope to see many of you there. And so goodbye for today.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep.